Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me, and thanks for you all taking time out of your day to listen to this presentation. And thank you, Corey, for that introduction. That was great. You'll probably hear me repeat aspects of that story throughout this program. So I'm here today to talk to you about lead in wildlife and how that impacts our wildlife, where it's coming from, and how to talk about it. This issue can get pretty contentious between certain audiences, so our goal at Sporting Lead Free is to make sure that you all have education and information so that you can make informed decisions and hopefully help us spread awareness about this. So I'll start by let's see if this works. Uh-oh. Perfect. Stronger fingers. As they would say, put a little mustard on it. So I am the program director for Sporting Lead Free. I've been with Sporting Lead Free for almost 4 years now. And I, as Corey noted, received my bachelor's in business administration with a focus in marketing and then a master's in resource conservation. So that might seem like a really bizarre combination, which it is. But what's been really great is I've been able to use my marketing background for conservation efforts. So my master's advisor always said, using the dark arts for good. So I've been really fortunate to be able to use both of my degrees in what I do today. So where we're gonna go today, taking you on a journey, we're gonna start with why hunting and angling. Then we'll move to the history of wildlife and lead, how wildlife are ingesting lead, the impacts on birds, and then human health and game meat, the good news, and how we can talk about it all. So action-packed day today. Before I move on to the next slide, can I just, by show of hands, and I know folks on Zoom, maybe you can raise your hand on Zoom too, tell me how many folks in the room here are active hunters or anglers? Great, so I'd say probably about half the room here. Not sure how many on Zoom. So I want to briefly, for those of you who maybe aren't in the hunting or angling community, just give you a brief idea of why hunting and angling is important. So for starters, it manages wildlife populations. It also helps us get a better understanding and appreciation for these wild spaces and why we want to conserve them. It benefits all wildlife through license sales, which I'll talk about a little bit in the next slide. It also controls the conflicts between humans and wildlife. That's becoming an increasingly, I don't want to say popular, increasingly common issue as we expand our populations into the wildlife-human interface. And then it helps feed the hungry, which I'll also talk about a little bit more later. It also contributes greatly to the economy. Believe me when I say you can spend a lot of money on fun hobbies, including hunting and angling. I didn't think that I would ever be that person with a million different things in my gear shed and a fly tying table and a whole mess of things, but this is one of those things that you can spend a lot of money on and contribute greatly to the economy. So just to give a little bit more background too, hunters and anglers by numbers. So only 6% of Americans 16 and older hunt. It's a very small percentage, and that's going down annually. We did see a small bump during COVID when people rediscovered the outdoors, but generally that's trending down. For angling, it's a little bit higher, about 17% of Americans 6 years and older fish. And of the $1.6 billion appropriated dollars from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for states' wildlife conservation, 59% of that comes a Pittman-Robertson excise tax. So for those of you in the room who might not know what that is an 11% tax that is put on anything that is hunting related. There's also a Dingell-Johnson excise tax that's for angling. So when I go to a sporting goods store and I buy a bino harness or I buy a box of ammunition, even if I'm not using that ammunition to go hunting, I'm just going to go shoot some steel, that is still 11% taxed. I don't see that as a consumer, that's built into the manufacturing, but that then directly goes to help our wildlife conservation efforts, which is incredibly beneficial for that. If any of you are waterfowl hunters, you have to purchase a federal duck stamp, and that directly goes to help protect, restore habitat for migratory waterfowl and other birds and wildlife, which is pretty awesome. So hunters and anglers contribute a lot to our wildlife conservation, even if it's not the species that we're directly targeting for those activities. So we're going to go down a little memory lane here. So lead poisoning was first discovered in wild birds in 1842. That was a long time ago. I'm sure there's things in this museum that were around that same time. So in 1991, the federal government banned the use of lead shot for waterfowl hunting. There's a lot I can talk about. That could be a whole presentation in it of itself. But just to give you kind of a broad view of that, what happened is our migratory birds, their populations were declining, and they discovered it was because of spent shot that was used by waterfowl hunters. These ducks were ingesting them. They dive down, they pick up grit and food off the bottom of waterways. They didn't know the difference between that grit and food from spent lead pellets. Ingesting it, they were getting lead poisoning. Bald eagles were coming down and feeding on these ducks that were easy prey, right? They were ill from the lead poisoning. And then our bald eagle populations were also in decline. That was paired with DDT. That was a huge issue at the time. So as an effort to not only increase our waterfowl populations, we also wanted to make sure our symbol of America, the bald eagle, was conserved. So at that time, in 1991, that's when they banned lead for waterfowl hunting. And that's when our lead ban stopped federally. I'm going to show you a couple graphs throughout this. Bear with me. Hopefully you can remember your time from seeing graphs and don't fall asleep. So another part of history is California condors. We don't have California condors here in Wyoming, but they are a species that is pretty dang unique to the United States, which is pretty cool. Even though they're quite ugly, they're pretty awesome birds, and we want to make sure that we are preserving all of these wildlife species. So California condors are what's called an obligate species, so that means they only eat dead things. They're quite lazy. They're not going to hunt for their own things. They just want to find that yummy dead thing on the ground. So in 1967, they became critically endangered. In the 1980s, only 22 individuals remained on the planet. So as a cumulative effort with scientists, they scooped up all of those birds and put them into a captive breeding program to try to make this species last longer, right? We want to make sure this species lasts because even though they might be an ugly, weird-looking bird, it is Halloween, they help us clean up our environment, right? So we want to make sure that we're protecting those birds as well. So at the time, they weren't really sure why these birds were dying off, so they did a couple different studies. And what they found was pretty astonishing. So between 1992 and 2019, about 50% of the condor mortalities that were collected were caused by lead. A lot of people were thinking, oh, that lead is coming from something, in the environment like leaded gasoline or lead paint from barns, old, barns. And what was actually discovered, they did what's called an isotopic test. So what they did is they matched the lead that was found in these condors with lead that was coming from ammunition manufacturing companies. So they were able to tie those together. So how that was happening was in gut piles from hunter harvested animals. So a pretty astonishing number there. That led to a couple different things happening in California. So not to bore you all with policy, but starting in 2011, they started a phase-out program in California for hunters there where they were asking hunters to stop using lead ammunition for hunting. And that then became full-on in 2019. If you got caught with lead ammunition while you were hunting, it was a huge fine. Unfortunately, what happened in California was that they led with legislation and not with education. So a lot of folks in California to this day do not know why they can't use lead for hunting. They don't know how to switch. There's some nuances with switching from lead to lead-free. And I'll talk more about ammunition in a second. And so there's a lot of distrust in California with that ban being put on because people don't know why they're doing it. They're just having Big Brother kind of tell them what to do, which none of us want to do that. When mom tells us to fold the laundry, we're going to play video games instead or something, right? So not to oversimplify, but that's what's happened. And the compliance in California is really low. So people are still using lead ammunition. Condors are still dying from lead poisoning. And so that's a really interesting example of how legislation, it meant good, meant to do something good, but the follow through of it was not so great. I'll pause for a second while Corey finds the haunted. I shouldn't have said it was Halloween. Okay, we'll move forward. So on to like my personal favorite species to talk about, golden and bald eagles. So 50% of golden eagles on migration have elevated blood lead levels. So when I say elevated blood lead levels, that means that it's found in their bloodstream. It's not necessarily that they're lead poisoned at the time. Just like you and me, we can have lead in our bodies and we still go about our day, right? There's a threshold that then overcomes and becomes a problem. But 50% of them flying during migration having elevated levels, not the best. I should also note, which I'll talk about a little bit later, that predominantly during the golden eagle migration, that's the same time our hunting seasons are in the West. So it's kind of a perfect storm for these guys. 95% of bald eagles tested during the hunting season have elevated lead. Again, it might not be enough to kill them, but it's something that will accumulate over time. Bald eagle populations are increasing. That's not only due to the fact that we banned lead for waterfowl hunting, but also because we don't use DDT anymore. A lot of people call bald eagles sky rats because there's so many of them now, which is awesome. There's such a great conservation success story, and we love seeing that. However, if we didn't have lead on the landscape from hunting, their populations would be doing even better. Similar story with golden eagles. So their populations are declining in some areas and plateaued, stable in others. And again, if we didn't have lead from spent ammunition and tackle, they would be doing quite a bit better. There's a couple new papers that came out in 2022 and 2023 that showed population level effects from lead ammunition and tackle on golden eagles in particular. So similar to if I just stand still, maybe it won't happen. I did stay at the Irma last night, so I might have come here with a ghost. We don't know. Okay, back to the pie chart. The average number of golden eagle deaths by cause during 1997 to 2016, you'll see that the poisoned category, it's 13.4%. But what I want to point out here is these other causes of death, so collision, electrocution, caught in a trap, disease, accident. These can all be attributed to that bird having lead poisoning. So when birds get lead poisoning, their whole system basically shuts down. And so it's really hard, to track really how these birds are dying. What was the cause? Chicken or the egg kind of scenario. So again, just to give you an example of the fact that, it might be directly in this study that 13.4% you can attribute exactly to lead poisoning, but these other causes might have also had an underlying reason, which would have been lead poisoning. So how exactly is this happening, you might ask? So we're going to talk about our sporting activities. So those of you in the room who said that you hunted, how many of you, by raise of hand, big game hunt? Cool. What about upland hunting? Amazing, I love it. And then angling? Wonderful. So unfortunately, and I am all of these things myself as well, so speaking to myself as well, unfortunately, a lot of these activities that we know and love and want to continue doing for generations, they do have components of lead in them that do enter the environment and enter the food web for other non-target species. So I'm going to go through all of these different pathways to lead exposure from these activities. So the first one I'll talk about is lead exposure through centerfire, rimfire, and slug ammunition. So this is primarily when you're hunting big game or varmints. So a hunter shoots an animal. That bullet, if it's a lead bullet, immediately upon impact begins to expand. And if it's a lead bullet, it begins to shed lead. In this, if I can find my laser pointer, these are x-ray images. This is of a prairie dog. This was shot with a 17 HMR bullet. All these little white fragments here, that's lead fragments. In this white-tailed deer up at the top here, these little white, I know it's really hard to see on this screen, those are all tiny lead fragments from the spread of the bullet. So what happens is, as hunters, we usually leave the guts in the field. I don't really want to eat those. I do bring home some of the organs. I love the heart. The liver I use for my dogs. But I'm not bringing home the intestines or the stomach, so those get left out in the field, which is an awesome resource as hunters we can provide, especially these migrating wildlife and other scavengers. With prairie dogs, a lot of folks don't shoot prairie dogs to eat them. They're shooting them to keep their land from getting disturbed and keeping populations at bay. Again, we leave those out in the field. So those now gut pile and unretrieved game now have these little lead fragments all throughout them. Our favorite little sky rats, like I talked about earlier, our bald eagles, our golden eagles, ravens, magpies, all sorts of scavengers. They come down and they have this awesome free meal. However, if it's full of lead, that's not quite an awesome meal. So this, again, is an x-ray of, I believe this one is a golden eagle, and it has these lead fragments in its stomach. So they get lead poisoning, which is a super bummer day for the eagles, and I'll talk about it being also a bummer day for hunters, right? We don't want to have that on our reputation. So for those of you who are not hunters in here, or even those of you who are, I didn't know a lot of this stuff until I had this job. I should also start by saying I didn't grow up in a hunting family, so an old dog can learn new tricks. Anyway, so I'm just going to talk about the different types of bullets really quickly. So there's 3 primary types of bullets that we can get commercially for centerfire bullets. The first is a cup and core bullet, which you can see literally looks like a cup of copper with a core full of lead. Cool. Oh, we'll see. I don't know if this... It's a go.
Try this one. If it's not,
Definitely something else. I don't know if this is better with this on. Now I'm going to get feedback and it's going to just scream. Bear with me. Okay. Maybe I'm full of static electricity. How exciting. Okay. Cup and core, that's your most basic bullet that you'll find on shelves. The next is a bonded bullet where the jacket of the bullet, which is typically copper, is molecularly bonded with the lead in it. They did this because for ballistics, you want your bullet to stay together. You want it to mushroom and punch through the animal to have that quick ethical kill. The bonded bullet, because the jacket is bonded to the lead, it does stay together quite a bit more, but it does still fragment. And the last one I'll talk about is a monolithic or alloy bullet. These are primarily made out of copper. There's also tin bullets out on the market now as well. And monolithic, think mono one. So it's one solid piece of metal. It's one piece of copper or tin. So when we talk about hunting bullets, there's so many different options out there. It's a huge menu. You go to any sporting goods store, it's pretty overwhelming to know what is what. And every brand, just like anything, everyone has their own name for what each bullet is and does, and the new whiz-bang thing out there. But just for your general knowledge, this is what the inside of a lot of our bullets look like, depending on what type of bullet you're using. So we're going to talk about lead distribution. So this bottom picture here, this is of a ballistics gel. So ballistics gel mimics soft tissue, what we're made out of, what animals are made out of. And what this does is it gives us a frozen image in time of what our bullet path looks like going through an animal. The ballistics gel doesn't have bone in it, so you have to kind of use your imagination if this were to hit bone, what it would look like. I'll tell you it's pretty catastrophically different. Think about a firework going off. But all of these little white dots, again, these are lead fragments through this whole wound channel. And if you come back to the Draper Museum in a couple months, weeks, you'll be able to see some ballistics gels on display here as well. So, and again, this is a kind of a bigger blown up, I know I'm probably in the way for some of you, picture of the carcass or the whitetail that was shot and x-rayed. So a while ago, they did a study where they actually, here in Wyoming, they shot a bunch of whitetail deer and then x-rayed their whole carcass and then gutted them and then x-rayed the guts. So this is where these numbers are coming from. So in a big game animal that was shot with a lead bullet, there are approximately 551 visible fragments in the whole carcass. I'm saying visible because they probably had a poor grad student sit there and look at these x-ray images and visually have to pick out the 551, fragments. Of course, it was a range of number, right? We now have computers that count those for us, and there's new studies out there that are actually saying there's hundreds, if not thousands, of these lead fragments because this dust particulate of lead that poor grad student probably couldn't see. So for the gut piles that then were gutted out of the animal and x-rayed, it was 160 visible lead fragments. All it takes is 20 milligrams of lead to kill an adult bald eagle. So in this here, up at the top, this red circle, that's encircling 20 milligrams of lead. So that's about the size of a grain of rice or the weight of a ladybug. Pretty much nothing. So if you think about all of these fragments that are left in a gut pile, or if you shoot an animal and you can't find it, it's left in the field, that's a lot of chances for eagles to have a bad day. That's a lot of chances for hunters to look bad. And we don't want that. We want to make sure that we can continue hunting into the future. So for those of you who are bird hunters, we talk about two different ways that lead gets into the ecosystem. The first is wounded birds. We all have a bad day where we make a shot on a bird. Maybe it wasn't the best. We know it hit the bird, but we can't find it. Our dog can't find it. We call those wounded birds. Because they're wounded, now they're easy prey for raptors, for birds of prey to come in and eat. Again, they can get lead poisoning. They're messy eaters. They don't really look at what they're eating. They're going to eat that lead shot, that embedded lead shot. And again, all it takes is 20 milligrams. So think about the size of a size 8 lead pellet. The other thing we talk about is grit pickers. This isn't a scientific term, but if you all have backyard chickens possibly, you know that birds tend to pick up off the ground. They pick up grit. That goes into their gizzard, and that gizzard acts as a grinding mechanism for their food. So when they're picking up grit, which is usually sand, pebbles, little pieces of rock, that kind of helps chew up their food, if you will. However, little tiny pieces of rock and lead pellets look really similar, and lead is really soft. So as soon as they pick that up off the ground, it's going to start breaking apart that lead, and they're going to get exposure to it, the game bird, whether it's a pheasant, a grouse. Sage grouse don't do this. That's the one species that doesn't. They're going to pick it up. Again, they're going to get lead poison. They're going to be easy prey for these birds of prey who then end up getting lead poisoning from that. So just like our bullets, I want to talk about shot shells. So again, there's 3 types of shot shells. Bird shot is those tiny little pellets all in the shell. Buckshot, those pellets are quite a bit bigger, primarily used for home defense or if you're doing like a river bottom white-tailed doe hunt. And then there's slug. Slug is really popular in the Midwest where our land is really small and we don't want to be shooting these high-powered rifles and going into somebody else's land. You want to make sure you're using ammunition and a mechanism that's not going to cause danger to everyone else. So they're more short range, although they're getting longer range. All right, so lead distribution in the uplands. Between 10 to 20% of game birds are wounded and unretrieved and could have a lead pellet embedded in their body if that person is using lead. 3.9% of pheasants have lead shot in their gizzard that were shot in a game preserve in South Dakota. 9.3% of wild chukars in Utah, 2.5% of doves in Arizona, Georgia, Missouri, Oklahoma, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, Tennessee. List goes on. So these images here, these are actually from a sharp-tail hunt that I just went on earlier this year. They're lead-free, don't worry. But you can see how those pellets can get embedded. And then this here, again, I'll try to move out of the way. This is an x-ray image of, I believe it was a pheasant that had all of these lead pellets in its gizzard. And then this was a duck that had all of these pellets in its gizzard. Birds can retain lead in their gizzards for days or weeks, meaning that they're continually getting that lead poisoning throughout the time having it in there. Lastly, I'll talk about tackle. So tackle, lost tackle, we all have those days where our knots don't do so well. We lose it, goes to the bottom of the waterway. Again, these diving ducks and geese and other water birds are going to dive down. They're going to see that shiny object, pick it up, either thinking it's food or grit. They're going to eat it, get lead poisoning. Swim away tackle, that trophy trout you thought was the best thing ever. Turns out your knot wasn't strong enough again. It breaks off. Birds like loons, bald eagles, and osprey, they eat fish in giant bites, if not swallowing them in their entirety. They're not going to notice that jig head or that split shot that's on the end of that line in that fish, and they're going to ingest it that way. So again, these are x-rays here. This is of a loon with a jig head in it, and same here. This is a loon that has a spoon in it, but then also a swivel, which traditionally had been made with lead. Lead distribution in tackle. This is an astonishing number. 51.7% of New Hampshire's common loon mortalities were from lead fishing tackle. That's a lot. 4,384 tons of fishing gear lost in the U.S. annually, which is quite sad. That's a lot of money going out into our waterways. And again, our mortality chart here. So this is for common loons in New Hampshire. You can see again that lead from fishing tackle is a pretty huge reason that these loons were dying in New Hampshire. So the scale of this issue is pretty large. At least 30 species of terrestrial birds are at risk of getting lead poisoning from spent lead ammunition. There's over 130 species of animals in general who are affected by lead, and some estimate that 20 million animals die from lead poisoning each year. So it's quite a bit. So why am I talking about birds? How many of you in here like birding? Okay, just for the Draper Museum, everybody raise their hand. So the reason birds are so affected is because many raptors feed on gut piles as a food source. Again, it's a free meal that they don't have to work to hunt to find. It's just like finding a piece of candy, hopefully not on the parking lot floor, and eating that. But birds love that, right? They love a free meal. Birds have extremely acidic digestive systems, and lead fragments become readily absorbed into their bloodstream. If I hold a lead fragment in my hand, I might get a little bit of surface absorption, not a ton. As soon as I hit an acid with that, it's going to start leaching out into whatever is around it. So whether that is the animal's body, or if I have a marinade that I'm making a nice meal in, it's going to start leaching out into that as well. Lead is then stored in the liver, kidney, brain, bones, and growing feathers. So just like humans, lead gets stored in our bodies as well. It's not something that we eat and then it goes away. It starts to accumulate over time, which is why a lot of these eagles over time will get more lead exposure. Some, they'll have one exposure incident and that's it. Others, it'll take, their whole lifetime. So just like humans, an ultramarathon runner can die from lung cancer just as much as someone who smokes a pack of cigarettes a day. It's really individual dependent, but the species in general of birds, they just have the perfect storm to be affected by lead. So what does that look like? This is one of those commercials you see on TV with like the people running around really happy and healthy, and then at the end they're like, and it can cause clenched talons, weakness, muscle wasting, emaciation, wing droop, blindness, head tremors, green diarrhea, crop stasis, seizures, regurgitation, and death. And that's not an exhaustive list. There's all sorts of other signs too. A lot of these signs mimic other issues that happen with birds. A lot of times, especially recently, we've had avian flu outbreaks, and a lot of the avian flu looks very similar to lead poisoning, but in most of our rehab facilities in Wyoming, at the Teton Raptor Center, they have a lead testing kit where they'll take blood from the raptor and it'll tell them how much lead is in their blood. So the sort of good news is that you can treat lead poisoning. It's called chelation. It's similar to chemotherapy where the patient is injected with a chelation and it binds to the lead and scrubs out of their blood. Irma didn't like that. I can also yell really loud, but that doesn't help the people on Zoom. Okay, they're working on it up there. Okay, so raptors are given this treatment for 5 days, twice a day. Then they get 2 days of rest, and then they repeat. Okay, we're on pause.
Check 1, 2, 3. Maybe.
How about now? Anyone remember those old Verizon commercials? I do. You want me to turn it off and on again? Testing. Sounds like it's on now. How do we sound? Beautiful? No. I don't think so. I'm on, just quietly. How about now? Great. All right, good to go for now. If I move, I'm scared to move. Okay, so raptors are given this treatment for 5 days. They get a break for 2 days, then they repeat it for 5 days. Similar to chemotherapy, it is really, really, really rough on the patient. Most of the time, I shouldn't say most of the time, a lot of the time raptors don't make it through this treatment. And a lot of the times the raptors that do come into rehab facilities are coming in for some other injury, whether they, were hit by a car, ran into a window, something else. So the rehabbers might also be trying to fix whatever the other injury might be that brings them into the rehab center. It's really rare for somebody to find a golden eagle that just has lead poisoning and bringing them in. It's usually another injury. Again, chicken or the egg, was the lead poisoning the reason that they received their other injury, or a lot of questions regarding that. So although it's a way to treat these birds, it's a long process and sometimes it's not very successful. So you guys remember me talking about lead distribution in the entire animal versus just the gut. So if you're like me and did some quick mental math, there's a lot of those fragments that are unaccounted for that are in the gut pile, but then where else are those 551? So what about that meat we bring home to our families? As hunters, that's one of our favorite things to do, is share a meal with our friends and family and tell them the story of our hunt. However, if I'm using a lead bullet, studies have been done, double-blind studies by both the hunter, the game processor, and the x-ray technicians, that about 8 to 59% of packaged meat, ground meat, can contain a lead fragment. At Sporting Lead Free, we x-ray all of the donated game meat that comes into our Hunters for the Hungry program in partnership with Whole Food Rescue and Wyoming Wildlife Federation, and we have found about 20% of our ground meat packages contain a lead fragment, 1.45 of steaks, roasts, other jerky, that sort of thing. This is an x-ray image here of some packaged game meat, and these here are lead fragments. They're glowing, they're bright. You might see this one over here. That's opaque. That's probably a piece of cartilage or bone. So I want to note, though, that this amount of lead, if we were to eat it, we'd probably be okay. If we have little kids at home, or if somebody is pregnant at home, it's just something we want to be aware of. So when we go and x-ray all this game meat, we're just labeling the packages so those consumers can make informed decisions. None of the game meat is wasted. We're just making sure that as consumers we're educated on that. How I mentioned earlier about holding lead in my hand, again, the same thing can happen with a marinade. If it's acidic, that lead can leach out. My dad is notoriously horrible at cleaning his birds, and until I was able to convince him to switch to lead-free, which you would think he'd support his daughter in her career, right? Now he does hunt lead-free, but he would make pheasant and make it for me, and I'll pull a lead pellet out. But if he made that in, a tomato base or something like that, that lead might now be in the meat of that pheasant and might have eaten it anyway. I have lots of fun stories too about eating game meat that ended up having a lead fragment in it, and friends being like, of course, you're the one that got that piece. Okay, so to bring a little bit of brightness into this, we know that lead consumption has adverse effects on humans. While a grown adult has little risk to lead consumption, like I said, kiddos and pregnant women, it's something they want to avoid. There is no study, nor will there ever be a study, where we feed kiddos game meat with lead in it and just see what happens down the line. We get a lot of people that say, well, you can't say that, lead is causing all of these issues and this and that. Yeah, I hope there's never a study. I hope none of our kids have to go through a study like that to prove those people, right or wrong. It's just another avenue where lead can come into our bodies that we just need to be aware of. I'm not going to tell you what to do, I'm just going to give you that information. Oh my gosh, so what is the good news here? I only have 2 more graphs, so bear with me. So this is done by my boss, Brian Bedrosian. He is the conservation director at Teton Raptor Center. And he was really curious as to what was going on with bald and golden eagles and their lead exposure throughout the year. So what he did is on the National Elk Refuge there in Jackson Hole, he captured bald and golden eagles throughout the year, and he measured their blood lead levels. You can see highlighted here in orange, that's about the hunting season. So you can see of the animals that were captured during the hunting season, they have elevated blood lead levels. So that told him not only that this was a problem that is associated with ammunition, but also that these birds have that impact throughout the year, but it spikes during that hunting season when humans can do something about it, right? So the following years, these last 2 years here, 2009 and 2010, he handed out free and discounted lead-free ammunition to hunters on the refuge. And what was really cool is he saw almost a 1-to-1 drop. Those hunters who were successful using a copper bullet, that percentage of successful hunters, that same percentage of blood lead level had dropped in the birds that he captured through that year. So that told him, 1, this is something caused by ammunition. 2, ammunition can solve it, which is awesome. How many conservation issues can one person making one decision have a really big impact on? So he was all excited about this, published the paper. As a scientist, said, cool, job is done. See you guys later. You're going to make the best decisions. Fast forward 10, 15 years, we're still having this conversation. So that's when he started sporting lead-free and found me. So just to reiterate, it's really cool to see in the data have it be that clear of a change when one person makes a difference. The other good news is there are awesome lead-free alternatives out there. So we want to continue hunting, we want to continue angling, but we want to do it in a way that we're not impacting non-target species. We want to do it in a way where our hunting heritage and our angling heritage has a positive light for those folks in our communities who maybe don't hunt or fish. We want them to know that we are the conservationists we say we are. So this leads back to my story, which Corey alluded to in the beginning. So I'm an adult onset hunter, which does sound like a disease, and my wallet would probably say that it is as well. So I didn't start hunting until graduate school. And while I was hunting in graduate school, one of my family friends had a moose tag. We were running around trying to find him a moose up in Montana with no luck. And he said, well, let's go find you a whitetail. Cool. So we're hunting on what's called a block management area in Montana. That is a private land that has public access for hunters, which I believe here in Wyoming, that's Access Yes, is a very similar program. They're awesome. Donate what you can to those programs. It's a great resource for people. However, on this particular day, we came across this coulee and saw this on the ground. So I'm not a bird biologist. At the time, I was still working on getting my resource conservation master's, so I'm a marketing gal. And I see this, but I know enough about animal behavior that this is not normal. This bird was sick, unsure what was going on. Luckily for me at the time, my neighbor volunteered at a raptor rehab facility in Montana, so I called her up. I said, I have a raptor on the ground that is sick, and I don't want to leave it out here for a coyote to get or for it to die in some other way. And where I was, there was all these power lines up above me, so I just assumed it had been electrocuted. So she says, oh, they're just like a parakeet. Just throw your hunting coat over this eagle and then grab its talons. It's just so easy. If anyone's ever dealt with a wild raptor, that is not a parakeet. And their talons are razor sharp. But I followed her directions. I threw a hunting coat over it and got it into our vehicle to bring to the raptor rehab facility. So at the time, again, I didn't know about lead-free or anything like that. I just knew this bird was in trouble. It had clenched talons, its wings were drooping, it had green diarrhea coming out. It was a whole scene. Unfortunately, this bird did not survive. He was so emaciated from having lead poisoning and being unable to hunt for himself that they couldn't even put him through chelation because it would have killed him anyway. So the most humane thing to do at that point was to euthanize. This was not a moment in my life that I thought was going to be as pivotal as it was. However, I'm really glad it happened because I have one of the coolest jobs out there. And after this event, I became that weird girl with all my friends telling them to switch to lead-free, because as soon as the raptor rehabber called me and said, oh, this bird had lead poisoning, and I began to question how. Again, I did kind of what I spoke about earlier. I was like, oh, they're not eating lead paint off of old barns. They're not huffing gasoline in tractors. What do you mean lead poisoning? And she explained what I just explained to you all today. So I immediately switched to lead-free, tried to get all my friends to switch to it, met with a researcher in Montana who was doing this sort of work up there. We did a newspaper article together, this whole thing. It was great. Finished grad school, like any normal grad student does. You send out a giant email to everyone, hoping anyone in the world will hire you. And I kept in contact with that researcher up in Montana. And he said, hey, I have a buddy down in Wyoming who's starting this initiative, Sporting Lead-Free. Do you want to maybe help him with that? And I said, oh my gosh, I can put my weird girl stuff into a job? Sure, doing it. So that is how I got to where I am today. So as Corey mentioned in the intro, Sporting Lead-Free is a non-political educational initiative working to reduce inadvertent lead consumption by wildlife and people through the voluntary choice of lead-free ammunition and tackle. Our mission is to encourage the use of lead-free ammunition and tackle in the field and promote the conservation ethics of our hunting and sporting communities. So again, I'm a hunter, he's a hunter. We want to make sure that this is a hunter-led initiative because we are the ones out there purchasing the ammunition. As anglers, we're the ones out there purchasing the tackle. So we want to make sure that we're able to speak the language, talk the talk, and make sure that we are putting our best conservation foot forward in an educational way. So we do that with a three-pronged approach: awareness, community, and access. So building awareness, doing things like this today. Community, we have a membership program, we have an ambassador program, and really we all get our information about hunting and angling through our buddies, right? So having that social network and having people growing that community of saying, hey, I'm a lead-free hunter, hey, I'm a lead-free angler, that will help us move the needle in this. And then access, we're working with a couple different retailers to make sure that lead-free products are accessible in sporting good retailers. When you go to your local store, it's really difficult sometimes to tell what ammunition and tackle is in fact lead-free. So we're working on doing some shelving, displays, some icons, things like that to help us not have to think as much when we go to purchase these things for our hunting and angling pursuits. So we want to talk really quickly about why language is key in this. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, this can be a really contentious issue, especially in the hunting side of things. As soon as we start talking about ammunition, a lot of people will get nervous about guns and, oh, you're going to take our ammunition away, which means you're going to take our guns away. And again, I'm a hunter, I own guns. I don't want that to happen either. I really see this as a way to protect our hunting heritage by showing people, hey, we can do the right thing when we're in the field. When I'm at the range, I'm still shooting lead. I'm getting used to my firearm. I'm shooting clays with my dad. But as soon as I go and I'm going to enter that food web, that's when I switch to lead-free. So both can be existing in the world. However, when you see headlines like this, and I'm just going to go through these really quickly, they really vilify hunters. They really vilify anglers. When the truth in reality is that we don't learn about this in hunter ed. We learn about the waterfowl ban, because that's waterfowl hunting, that's a big part of it. But it stops there. And so this isn't something to shame people about. This isn't something to start an argument about. This is something to start a conversation about. So we really want to be careful when we're speaking with people about this, that we're not leading it in that argumentative way at all. It's really about teaching people something they didn't know, which is honestly my favorite part of the job, when someone does come up to me really mad about what I do and they leave being really excited to learn more. So you might ask, okay, what about a ban on lead? Why isn't sporting lead-free into bans? You're just educating folks. An example I showed you earlier is California. That's a really good example of why we want to make sure education is first and not legislation. Some other things to talk about. It's difficult to enforce in big game hunting in particular. So these two bullets here, one of them is a copper bullet and one of them is a lead bullet. The tip of it is called a ballistic tip. Those colors don't mean anything. That's just like nail polish for bullet manufacturers. Everyone has their own unique color. But for conservation officers and game wardens in California, they can't tell the difference between these two type of bullets. So it makes their job really hard. A job that's already really hard, it makes it harder. So compliance is hard because it's difficult to enforce. Compliance is low, like I said. Again, the California example. manufacturing challenges, it's a very different process to manufacture copper bullets than it is lead bullets. So that's a big lift to ask all of our manufacturers to start producing lead-free ammunition instead of lead ammunition. And again, there is a place for lead when it's at the range, when it's in a condensed area. My local trap club, I live up in Missoula now, they just sent an email out to club members saying, hey, we mined out all of the lead in the field and we sent it out and had it re-poured, and now you can buy it in bulk if you want to reload with the lead pellets, which is awesome. That's such a great way to recycle that. But manufacturing challenges, especially in big game, they are different and they're hard, and we want to make sure we're not shooting our manufacturers in the foot when they're the ones that can help us move this issue forward. The ammunition market for hunting is really small. Most people use ammunition for sport shooting, home defense, that sort of thing. The actual market for hunting ammunition doesn't make up that big piece of the pie. These knee-jerk reactions, they lead to legislation that's actually going to harm us. So because of all of the legislation that gets brought up about banning lead for hunting, you get things like this happening where now we have a ban against banning ammunition. So again, that works against us. We don't want that to happen. So how to change the narrative? Instead of saying we should just ban lead, say use lead free when there's a chance of lead getting into the food web. Instead of saying lead is poisonous, say you're implying again, you're shaming the hunter. Instead say, hey, copper is a really awesome alternative when you're out in the field. Hunters are stuck in their ways and don't care about wildlife. This is absolutely not true. Many hunters don't know and they haven't heard the right message. Again, coming at this with an educational bend and not a shameful one. So some really quick talking points. Do start with education. Be pro-lead free, not anti-lead. Create a conversation, not a lecture. I know I'm lecturing you guys right now, but we'll have a conversation here in a minute if I don't break the microphone again. Find common ground. Most all of us, whether we're hunters or anglers or not, we have something that we have common ground with. Whether it's we have grandkids, whether it's we love bird watching, something is going to be a common ground. So find that. And then share this message with your network. Even if you yourself are not a hunter and angler, I bet you know someone who is. So don't, again, start in a defensive position. Shame people for not knowing. Don't get frustrated. Not everyone is going to change. I know at the Thanksgiving dinner table, I have an uncle who will never change. That's fine. I'm not going to change everyone's mind, but what is so cool about this issue is one person can make such a big difference, and that's really rare in the conservation world. Don't claim to know everything. There's so much information. Just like I said, I didn't know most of this when I first started this position, and I know more about bullet ballistics now than I ever hope to learn again. So you can use us as a resource. We have a great website, social media, all kinds of things for messaging and talking points. We have outreach materials, presentations like this. If you belong to a group that would appreciate something like this. We also do shooting demonstrations, so we can show you the difference between performance of lead and lead-free and big game hunting. We also have handed out lead-free tackle here in Wyoming to the kids' fishing days, so starting kids young and teaching them that conservation message young. So what can all of you do? Here's your call to action. You can become a Sporting Lead-Free member. You can talk to your friends and family. You can like us on social media, always that plug. You can donate to help us continue this work. And you can ask your local retailers, if they don't already carry lead-free alternatives, ask them, say, hey, have you heard about this? Have you heard about that? Can you start carrying this? The more we ask and demand for it, the easier it's going to be to get. The lower, prices and availability, those difficult barriers are gonna start to go away. So like I said, we have a website full of resources. I'm sorry I'm speeding up because I know we're lower on time, but with that, I'll leave it with any questions that I can answer.
Check one.
If you find you're in possession of lead-based bullets, paraphernalia, how do you dispose of that?
Yeah, so the question was, if I have lead bullets and ammunition at home, how do I dispose of it? Great question. For me, I use it at the range. So lead and copper in big game hunting, they perform pretty similarly, but there are a little bit of differences. If you're just trying to get used to a new firearm, the trigger, the recoil, use that lead. If you just want to go and shoot with your buddies and shoot steel, use the lead. That's awesome. Like I said, I shoot lead also when I'm trap shooting with my dad. Most shooting ranges have a lead mitigation plan in place. So that means that just like I explained at my trap club, every once in a while they'll scoop it up and they'll either recycle it for themselves or sell it to car battery manufacturers. They use a lot of lead in car batteries. So the answer is to use it in a place that either has a mitigation plan in place or it's in a condensed, controlled area.
One from online, and if someone's talking in the mic, you won't have to repeat it, but this is probably a question you get asked quite a bit regarding lead-free ammunition, but is lead-free ammo much more expensive or not?
So you don't want me to repeat the question? You got it. Okay, cool. So that is a question I get a lot, and the answer is the annoying one. It depends. So just like anything in our world, there's an economy level of something and there's a premium level of something. If I'm switching from a more economy level lead bullet to a copper bullet, I'm going to spend 10, 20, 30 more dollars for that box of ammunition. That's $1 to $3 more per round. If I'm switching from a very premium lead bullet, like I explained here, a bonded bullet, I might end up saving money when I switch to a lead-free alternative. So it really depends on what you're switching from, and it also really depends on leveling with yourself. So again, I'm going to the range, I'm target practicing, I'm going to shoot lead. As soon as I'm ready to switch to copper to go in the field to go hunting, I'm going to sight it in a little bit more with my copper. In case there are those differences, there probably will be. And then I'm going to go out and use the copper. Hopefully I'm only using one bullet of copper, right, out there in the field. If not, that's okay too. But shot placement is number one. Number two is your bullet selection, in my opinion. So really leveling with yourself on what you're investing in. So that bullet is the one thing that's hitting your animal, not your new camo jacket, not your, fancy hunting pack. Your ammunition is something that you should really invest in.
Another question: with hunting season beginning or right around the corner, where can those of us that are interested in finding lead-free ammunition find some? If it's challenging to find some in person on the shelf in a smaller rural community, are there online resources or other avenues that we can get a hold of lead-free ammunition?
Yeah, absolutely. So on our website, I don't know if I can go back, we do have a find ammo button. So that links you to a website called AmmoSeek, and our link is already filtered for lead-free, and what that does is it's a little bot that crawls all the online retailers from your mom and pop shops all the way up to Midway, and it'll show you who has what in stock and what the price is. So luckily we live in a state in Wyoming that you can still purchase ammunition online. There are states and there are boroughs that you cannot purchase ammunition online, but thankfully we still can. So if you can't find it on your store shelves, if your local retailer hasn't ordered it in yet, you can usually find it online. Most common calibers of ammunition are easy to find. If you're shooting, the newest caliber out there on the market, might be a little bit harder to find. I'm trying to think what the newest one that just came out was. That the 7 PRC maybe, but there's lead-free in that too. And I should add too, the one benefit that came out of California's ban is that every single ammunition manufacturer who wanted to sell into California had to come up with a lead-free bullet. So most of those manufacturers that we're familiar with, Federal, Nosler, Hornady, I know I'm missing a bunch, they all have a lead-free bullet. It's just a matter of educating yourself as a consumer to know, Hornady's lead-free bullet is called the CX. Federal's is called Trophy Copper, so again, that education piece. And if you're struggling, please reach out to me. That's what I'm here for.
So ballistically, is there a difference between a copper and a lead?
Yeah, so I love that question too. So ballistically, from a terminal ballistic standpoint, at ethical hunting ranges, so 500 and less yards, they ballistically are very similar, if not the same, again, depending on the bullet, depending on your caliber. The one downside to copper, which is being fixed, is your long-range shooters. So because copper is not as soft as lead, at distance, it's harder for that copper to expand. So it loses that speed, it loses that ability to expand. So that's why I say at ethical hunting ranges, so sub 500 yards. I know right now there's a big trend in long range shooting on a personal level. I don't love that for hunting. I think that's great for sport shooting. But I do have a fair chase question for folks who are wanting to poke an animal at 1,200 yards. There are ammunition manufacturers out there that are starting to do those longer range bullets in a monolithic bullet, in a copper bullet for hunting. I will note that the world record for the longest distance shot was about 4 miles, was done with a copper bullet. They are super, super accurate. That bullet was designed specifically for competitive shooting. That was not made for hunting, so with that caveat. But yeah, from a hunting, from a everyday person hunter perspective, ballistically they're about the same.
So ballistic coefficient, the mushrooming effect, how's that different?
Yeah, so that's also a great question. So the biggest thing for bullets to be effective, there's a couple different things. So you want a bullet that's going to carry energy into the animal. You want it to expand because you need that expansion to create that really nice wound channel. You also have this thing called hydrostatic shock. So think about like an MMA fighter or a boxer getting punched in the face, that shock wave sending it through and knocking them out. That same thing happens with our bullets. So you have all those combination of things, and then obviously the wound channel going into the vitals and creating all that. So ballistically, from an expansion standpoint, they're fantastic. The cool thing with copper is because it doesn't have lead in it, it doesn't shed that weight, it keeps that weight retention, so it can punch through a lot further of an animal. So just think about like if you're swimming through a pool and you start like losing limbs, like you're probably not going to keep swimming very fast. That's a really gruesome example. But from a bullet standpoint, ballistically, you want that weight retention. You want it to punch through that animal. If you have a little bit hairier of a shot, they're quartering away, I'm going to have that bullet pass through for more of the animal to get to my vitals. That copper bullet's going to more more accurately do that than a lead bullet that might lose a lot of that weight in those fragments and not get through the animal. I don't know if that answers your question.
You see more penetration all the way through the animal before it mushrooms now with copper?
Yeah, so this is another really cool benefit with copper. So the question was, do you see more penetration into the animal before it mushrooms? It depends again on the bullet manufacturer too, but most copper bullets, they actually have a delayed expansion, which is awesome because that means it's expanding when it's in the vitals instead of in that meat. So you get less meat loss. This is going to be a way to answer your question, so bear with me. I was dating a guy who thought this was all smoke and mirrors, like, well, whatever, Hannah, you're crazy. And we shot our deer about 2 days apart, hung them in the garage, we were processing them. I'm doing my thing, he's doing his thing. He looks over, he goes, I know you're pretty OCD, but you're not throwing out any bloodshot meat. And I was like, well, yeah, I used a copper bullet. He's like, what do you mean? He said, come look at this. Because copper doesn't fragment, doesn't create all those additional wound channels, which more often than not are just damaging your meat than hitting a vital, and because that expansion is delayed, that damage happens in the vitals and not in the meat. So he was like, man, I don't really care about the eagles. We're not dating anymore. I don't really care about the fact that I might be eating lead, but I don't want to lose any more meat. So he's like, I'm going to switch to lead-free because I want to keep more meat.
Not the worst outcome. So this may vary depending on what the person is asking, but they're asking how many state fish or wildlife departments are on board with lead-free ammunition.
Ooh, that's sort of a spicy question. I like it. So, as an example, here in Wyoming, we have, I know Director Nesvik is retired. However, I guess it was last year, maybe the year before, we had presented to the commission, and they were like, wow, your guys' approach is awesome. We love the education. We love what you're doing for the youth in our Wyoming communities. They essentially gave us a stamp of approval of, we want you to continue doing what you're doing. They gave us a commissioner license to help us in our fundraising efforts. So Wyoming Game and Fish is, I'm doing air quotes, on board to match the question. We are getting ballistic gel displays in a lot of your game and fish departments around the state, which is really awesome. So look for those. We also are working with the hunter ed instructors here in Wyoming to make sure that just tidbits of this are in the hunter ed instruction so kiddos can learn about, or adult onset hunters. I took hunter ed when I was an adult, that we're learning about this from day one. The other example, I'm in Montana, so we have two FWP, Fish, Wildlife, and Park offices that have ballistic displays going on. We're again working with their hunter ed instructors to get all of them trained up on how to talk about this. And then lastly, in Colorado, this is kind of an example of an interesting like legislative and education mix. They were recently legislated to have an educational initiative about lead-free, so we've been helping them develop those programs and helping them train their teachers on how to go about talking about this. So that includes doing shooting demonstrations, talks like this, talking to them how to talk to kiddos about this, because as adults this is a big concept. If you can imagine a kid trying to understand this, it's kind of wild, but we have our ways. So yeah, those are our three biggest ones right now. We are working in Minnesota as well, and we have partner organizations who are also doing very similar work in other states to get this going.
I got time for last two questions.
Well, I just wanted to comment. So my son and family live in New Hampshire, and they're lead free with all their fishing tackle for sure. I don't know about hunting, but I would guess also.
Yeah, so as a result of that New Hampshire study, you cannot fish with lead tackle in New Hampshire anymore. And there's a couple other northeastern states where you either can't fish with it or you can't even purchase it. So the Northeast is ahead of the game on that as far as keeping their loon population safe.
Were you able to approach the senators after their anti-headline?
I love those spicy questions. We did reach out to them. I should say too, at Sporting Lead Free, we really do stand on our education, not legislation. However, we love to educate legislators. So we did try. We were not responded to, or at least the response was a form email. So we're going to try again. Again, I think a lot of the legislation that gets brought up comes from the opposite ends of the spectrum, and we really like to serve as that middle ground, right? I get yelled at from environmentalists as much as I get yelled at from pro-gun rights people. For me, it's fun to be in the middle getting yelled at by everyone. That's not for everyone. That's not everyone's cup of tea. But for the most part, I can find the middle ground between opposing sides, and I think that's so important for our legislators because they typically only hear the loudest voices in the room, and those tend to not be those of us in the middle. So we're working on it, but if anyone has connections to legislators or if you need help educating a legislator, please reach out.
Hannah, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you all so much.